All right, well, Shabir says that the commands to fight unbelievers, I'll start at the end there. Shabir says that the commands to fight unbelievers because there were two groups, believers and unbelievers, but it's not saying to fight unbelievers just because they're unbelievers. Now, I gave the historical context of 929. The Quraysh were wondering how they're going to make money, and then Muhammad receives a command to fight the Jews and the Christians until they pay the jizya as a way of making money. So how exactly does that historical context or the literary context, keep in mind we read the entire passage, there was not one word about self-defense in that entire passage. So if that's what Allah really means, couldn't he say one word about this having something to do with self-defense instead of complaining that Christians say that Jesus is the Son of God and that we try to extinguish the light of Allah with our mouths? Couldn't he have put one word in that passage when he calls on Muslims to fight us? I mean, let me give an example here. Suppose there's a politician. That politician, after some terrorist attack, comes out and says, we must fight those who believe in Allah. And suppose there's a lot of negative publicity, and then he comes back and says, well, I was only talking about terrorists. Would you say, hey, you need to be a little more clear when you're talking about fighting people? If you're talking about killing people, you need to be very clear about whom you're talking about here? Would we accept if a president of the United States stepped up and said, we must fight those who believe in Allah? And then when he's challenged on, he says, no, I'm just talking about particular people who believe in Allah and were attacking us. That's all I meant. We would never accept that. We would never accept that communication. Why do you say that you're applying that reasoning to Allah, who claims to be perfectly clear in his commands? Allah says he means exactly what he says. Well, aren't there words for fight in self-defense? Aren't there words for fight people who are attacking you? Why does he say fight those who do not believe? Everything Shabir is saying about what Allah really means, Allah could have said that. Allah could have said it just as clearly as Shabir did, but he didn't. He repeatedly emphasizes fighting unbelievers. And when he says, those who are with Muhammad are severe against disbelievers and merciful among themselves, how could the categories be any more clear here? They couldn't. Now, Shabir says that Muslim writers invented stories to justify their own violence. I have to point out all those sources contain peaceful passages as well. So if they're just trying to justify violence, then why didn't they wipe out the peaceful passages? The only conclusion to draw is that they're trying to do Islamic history as well as they can, and that they preserve both. But those peaceful and violent teachings of Islam all fall into the same categories as the peaceful and violent teachings of the Quran. Shabir again says that silm means peace everywhere it's used in the Quran. As far as that form of silm right there is used once in the Quran in that verse. We have the historical background. We know the historical background. This isn't how are we going to interpret this. We know the historical background. The translation, enter completely into peace, makes no sense as a response to, here's a guy who continues to keep the Jewish Sabbath. Makes no sense. There's only one interpretation that makes sense, and that's why every respected Muslim commentator that I could find translates it as Islam. And, of course, Shabir seeks the one who fits that view. But this just doesn't overwhelm the historical context and the vast array of Islamic commentators who give the correct meaning. Now, why do Muslims think that certain Quran verses abrogate others? He complains about me quoting al-Wahidi. I quoted al-Wahidi just for some diversity, because I tend to quote Ibn Abbas and Ibn Kathir, both of whom say that verses of the Quran abrogate other verses of the Quran. But there's another problem here. Let's look at one of the verses we quoted. Chapter 2, verse 106. Whatever communications we abrogate or cause to be forgotten, we bring one better than it or like it. Notice that part. Whatever verses we abrogate or cause to be forgotten. So, some things are being caused to be forgotten. Allah will reveal something and then he causes it to be forgotten. Shabir says, well, this is talking about prior revelations. Well, in chapter 87, verses 6 to 7, Allah says specifically to Muhammad, he's talking to Muhammad here. He's not talking about anyone, he's talking to Muhammad. He says, we will make you recite the message, so you shall not forget except as Allah wills. So this is Allah talking to Muhammad. Muhammad, we're making you recite the message, so you shall not forget except as Allah wills. So Muhammad himself is forgetting things that are revealed to him from Allah when Allah wants him to forget those things. So is this applying to previous revelations? No, it's applying to the revelations to Muhammad. That's according to the Quran. I'm not quoting a commentator there. That's Allah saying that Muhammad forgets revelations because Allah wants him to. Now, I said I have more respect for Muhammad. Shabir says, I said I have more respect for Muhammad's sayings than Western Muslims. No, I have more respect for the clarity of Quran verses and quotations from Muhammad, namely that Allah says he means what he says, and that's what we would find with Muhammad as well. And if you wanted to reinterpret them, you have to accuse them of being horrible communicators. He says that I actually like ISIS killing people because I can use that to win converts. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, you heard it here. I love it when ISIS goes around raping their captives and chopping people's heads off and crucifying them and blowing their brains out, because I think it'll really help me in my ministry work. Now, as far as later Muslims corrupting history, I just have to point this out. Here again, I have more respect for the integrity of the early Muslim community than Shabir does. When he's rejecting these passages and saying, "Oh, people made them up," keep in mind these guys are tracing their claims back to very early Muslim authorities here. When we talk about abrogation, these are passages that go back to Umar and Uthman, the second and third rightly guided caliph, and some of Muhammad's closest companions. Well, they're lying. They're lying when they say that this abrogated that. Someone in the earliest Muslim community must be lying, right? If Shabir is serious about this, I have to say he's not very far away from the same argument that is used by people who say Muhammad never existed. People like Robert Spencer, who claim Muhammad may have never even existed. He basically says that certain Arabs at a certain time realized that they need some uniting figure, and so they invented a bunch of stories. And they invented this figure of Muhammad, who may have been an actual figure, but at least they invented much of his history in order to rally them, and then so that they could go out and fight and win and conquer. So that's the claim. And what's Shabir saying? Well, all these passages about fighting and subjugating and so on, yes, they're there, but this was later Muslim leaders inventing these passages to justify their own actions. Well, if they can invent the history of Muhammad that way, why couldn't they invent a little more so that we can't know anything about Muhammad? Let me put it this way. If the earliest generations of Muslims were this big, massive group of deceivers writing things to justify what they're doing, how can we know anything about Islam? By the Quran? The Quran only mentions Muhammad by name 4 times. 3 of those could be a title and not even a name. So we have to go outside the Quran for sources. But if this is nothing but a bunch of liars, my Muslim friends, don't tell me that you know a whole lot about Islam if you're accepting this method.